Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I would like to welcome you to a special 5-part episode on suspension and debarment. First, a word from our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, Inc. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across all industries. With its knowledge of effective compliance and ethics programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even of individuals. Having served in over 700 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance program, visit our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. In this 5-part series on the intricacies of suspension and disbarment, I'm joined by Rod Grandin. Rod is a managing director at Affiliated Monitors, and he's going to help us walk through what suspension and debarment is, but more importantly, why it needs to be studied, understood, and learned by the greater compliance community. We're going to take up 5 separate topics in this 5-part series. Number 1, what's the difference between criminal civil actions and suspension and debarment? 2, what's the actual difference between a suspension and a debarment? 3, what's the relationship to the FCPA and other matters to suspension and debarment? 4, what are factors considered as part of suspension and debarment present responsibility determination? And 5, what are some of the remedies and responses under suspension and debarment? I know you'll find this fascinating series very useful for you as the compliance practitioner. This special 5-part series on suspension and debarment is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello again, this is Tom Fox. I hope you have been joining me for this 5-part exploration of suspension and debarment with Rod Grandin, Managing Director at Affiliated Monitors. And today we put it all together with Part 5 on remedies and compliance. Rod, I wanted to actually start off with something that I found very interesting. You said in our Part 4, and I hope I wrote it down correctly, which was essentially that the defense community, you believe the defense community is actually ahead of the commercial community when it comes to having compliance in place and working with suspension and debarment officers. If I've got that correct, I was wondering if you might comment on that.
Yeah. So my experience, and I'm sure there are those in the in the world that would dispute this, but my sense is that the defense community largely led the process of putting together effective ethics and compliance programs. And I think a lot of this is due to, frankly, the initiatives and organizations that support the defense community. And to call out particularly the Defense Industry Initiative, where the contractors get together and they talk about what it takes to promote ethics and compliance. And they've been doing this for years. I think if we go back roughly 10 years, at least my experience is when I go back 10 years in the world of ethics and compliance, what I experienced as an Air Force suspending and debarring official is a lot of paper products. There's a lot of paper out there that talked about ethics and compliance, but people and companies were not embracing what they had in paper. And over the years, I've seen this major shift from these paper programs to a situation where companies have invested very heavily to build infrastructure to give life to these programs, to hiring and having in place very senior officials to operate as their chief compliance officers, to having a great deal of investment into their training and their communications program, and to make ethics and compliance a part of the way the company operates. On the commercial side, when I still, from time to time, in my role as the Air Force suspending and debarring official, came across commercial companies, I found that there was a bit of a lag there. And again, I attribute that a little bit to just the lack of an organization to sort of shepherd them along. Now, more recently, I think there's been a tremendous growth in understanding that ethics and compliance is critical for any company, whether it's in the defense sector or the commercial sector, and that companies are willing to do what is necessary to build these programs and to try to instill within their workforce appropriate standards of conduct, clear expectations for employee behaviors, and an understanding that there are consequences that flow from this. They've worked hard to create the speak-up cultures that allow communications to go up from the bottom of the workforce and down from the top of the workforce. There is the tone at the top that ethics and compliance are important. Doing business with integrity is critical for the company, and not just to avoid problems, but it's just important. Be honest with your customers and your stakeholders. All of this is absolutely critical. But again, my sense is that initially the defense community led this. I've been out of that now for a year and a half. So I think the commercial community has quickly, swiftly moved to catch up with this, particularly among the more of the larger companies. Where I believe there is still a lag is within respective supply chains. It is easy not easy, but it is larger companies have the ability to build infrastructure and to do what is right from a process and procedure standpoint. As you go down, as a company goes down its supply chain, there's still struggles once you get to that mid and lower level supply chains where the companies get smaller and smaller. A lot of smaller companies don't understand the need to embrace ethics and compliance. And my point to them is that it's all quite scalable. The investments and the infrastructure that it takes for a large company to achieve success in their ethics and compliance area is vastly different from a company of 100 employees, where a single leader has the ability to reach out and directly touch and affect the expectations and behaviors of each and every employee. So I believe this is entirely scalable. But a long way to answer. I think the defense industry sort of hit it off well. And frankly, there's probably an explanation for that. Many of the large defense contractors can build these fairly sophisticated programs. It becomes a matter of their overhead, and in many cases, that overhead goes to their government customers. Commercial companies don't generally have that kind of an opportunity.
Rod, I wondered if we might turn to how an agency would look at several different types of potential remedies, and if you could walk us through that.
Right. So as I addressed in some of the earlier segments, federal agencies, particularly within the Department of Defense, look to coordinate fraud remedies. When there's indication of misconduct within a government contract or involving a government contractor, fairly broadly defined, there's a focus on identifying and coordinating remedies, whether they be criminal, civil, administrative, to include suspension, debarment, or contractual. In almost every one of these cases, there's at some point going to be an analysis that's going to come down to the integrity of that contractor. What does it have in place to achieve compliance within its business operations? And there's going to be, whether it's Department of Justice, an agency suspending a debarring official, there's going to be some focus on, can this company be trusted to get it right, whether it's in their commercial operations or whether it's in their government contracting operations. So the remedies, again, can be across the board. Where I have the experiences in the suspension debarment realm. Generally speaking, when these cases come in, they're ultimately resolved. And again, the step is there evidence to support the cause for the action? If so, then the inquiry goes to whether or not the contractor is presently responsible. And that's where the focus is going to be on ethics and compliance. And those companies that embrace the principles that I outlined in one of the earlier segments are going to have an advantage and be much better positioned in that type of a review. Again, it's critical that companies take these challenges seriously, that they have ethics and compliance programs, that they test and make sure that those programs and those efforts are achieving the type of results that are expected in terms of employee behavior, in terms of good communication throughout the organization. In the realm of suspension debarment, there are many cases in which we look at a contractor's present responsibility and we go, close, but still we're lacking in competence. And in those cases, we can enter into what is called an administrative agreement or a compliance agreement, and essentially create an opportunity over time. Usually these agreements are in place for roughly 3 years, but they give the contractor an opportunity to more holistically look at its operations and assess what it needs to do to truly build a strong ethics and compliance program. And to do so, generally, subject to the oversight of the government, who in most cases will require the company that has entered into the administrative agreement to hire an outside independent monitor to assess whether or not it is achieving those objectives. And this creates this opportunity for companies who are demonstrating the ability to be responsible to continue to participate in the federal marketplace while that trust relationship involving the contractor's integrity is continuing to be established. And the critical piece again, though, comes down to companies gain themselves a tremendous advantage in any of these sanctions reviews, civil, criminal, or suspension debarment, by having in place strong commitment to ethics and compliance, solid training programs, that they're willing to test these programs and stay on top of their risk profile, whether they do it through internal resources or they hire outside independent objective sources to come in and assist them. The challenge is you can't be complacent in this space. Complacency will create major problems. And I cannot tell you how many times over the years I've had to deal with companies that had in place at one point a very strong ethics and compliance program, but they took their eyes off the ball. They lost their sense of urgency, and their ability to keep it fresh and active basically floundered. And they ended up with basically a paper program. And that is a problem that is completely avoidable if companies will keep their eye on this ball and make the commitment and, as appropriate, the investment to build these appropriate ethics and compliance programs.
Ron, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but there is one more question I wanted to ask you before we close out, and that's really about monitoring. Not only how a monitor would do an independent assessment of a compliance program, but really your thoughts on what are the qualities of an effective monitor from either a suspension and debarment officer or the government's point of view. And I think that is something that people really are interested in. What are the qualities of an effective monitor? Could you give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, over the years, I've used monitors in many, many agreements. And what I've found absolutely critical in a monitor is the need for that individual to be independent and objective in their approach to the business. The monitor is not there to be an advocate. That's the lawyer's job. The monitor there is to be an independent and objective set of eyes and ears for the regulator, for the government regulator. Now, in many cases, that can be a very tricky situation because generally the business relationship or the contract is with the company. The company is the client. But notwithstanding that relationship, there has to be an arm's length between that monitor and the company. That's not to say it's antagonistic, and it never should be a gotcha proposition, where the monitor is trying to, through trickery or otherwise, put the contractor into an awkward situation or the company being monitored into an awkward situation. So independence, objectivity, a good business sense. The individual has to understand, how businesses operate. What are the challenges associated with a very diverse workforce? In many cases, different languages, operating in different countries. They have to be able to take in all of these different considerations and at the end of the day, be reasonable. And that really, I think, sums it all up. The need for reasonableness in this process. It's easy for people to say, and frankly, I think the government is a little guilty on this, to say, this is what we want. And in many cases, what they want is perfection. Well, perfection is nice to strive for, but in the real world where you're dealing with diverse workforces, many challenges across the board, perfection just cannot be achieved. So there has to be one of reasonableness. What is a reasonable approach? How do you measure reasonable efforts given the facts and circumstances on the ground? That's what I look for in effective monitoring. Frankly, what I hope I bring to the table now working as a monitor.
So, Rod, this has been a fascinating exploration of suspension and debarment. We have really explored multiple topics beyond simply the title of our series. We've looked at compliance and ethics. We've looked at the role of monitors. We've looked at the roles of self-reporting and remediation. We've gone into the weeds where you've cited to us many, or rather several, of the specific regulatory statutes dealing with suspension and debarment. And I hope that our audience really has a much fuller appreciation now of how suspension and debarment relates really directly to many different types of compliance and how you can utilize many of the tools, tactics, skills, and developments that you and your colleagues in the federal government and now in private practice have developed really on the federal sector to help out companies more on what I would call the commercial sector. So I really wanted to thank you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Tom, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I hope you'll join us again for our next episode. This special 5-part series on suspension and debarment is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.